Hi, it's Laura. Thanks for stopping by my channel, Aquamarine18, and I am here with my first depth year update for 2020. It is just into the beginning of February, so it feels like a good time to check in. I will link below the video where I talk about the parameters for my 2020 depth year and how I'm thinking about it in a bit more detail. So if you haven't watched that yet, you can go and check that out. And if this whole idea of depth year is totally new to you and somehow you've just stumbled on this video, I do explain in my first video what a depth year is. It is something that seems to be kind of having caught on in the tarot community and of interest to folks. So I always intended on providing regular updates. I've been thinking about through January like what that would look like, whether I wanted to do monthly updates in the depth year. But I've decided to kind of do things a little bit more free form, I guess. Not necessarily monthly. I feel like, judging by how things have been so far, some months may be like pretty uneventful. I may not have a whole lot to say. And I also know that I have some ideas that I have been thinking about so far in terms of depth here that will fit more in terms of a kind of thematic update or discussion rather than a kind of periodic one. So I'm going to have a playlist dedicated to Depth Year 2020 and everything will be there in chronological order, but I'm not going with any strict like structure to updates other than the fact that I will put Depth Year update at the start of every related video as I have for this one. So kind of the short version of the Depth Year update so far is that like things are going well, and I have kind of stuck with all of my parameters that I've set for myself. I wrote them all down in the back of my Metaphysician's Day Planner. And so, just very briefly, I had decided that I would not start any new types of arts or craft type hobbies and only kind of buy materials when I was out of something for a hobby or activity that I am already doing. And also that I wanted to go deeper with practices, hobbies, and activities that I've done before and maybe drifted away from or not had that much time for. And I've totally stuck to that. I've bought basically nothing. I've cross-stitched, but that's a pre-existing hobby. I haven't bought anything for that, but I've been working on a pattern. And I have been getting back to something that I really wanted to do this depth year, which is learning again or reconnecting to playing the piano. So I'll just show, sorry in advance, this is going to be a little bit bumpy, but I did by myself at the end of last year a little treat, which you can see over there. You can also see my microphone, which is my new keyboard. And so I've been playing keyboard pretty much every day, slowly getting the skill back. I played for a very long time and, through my youth and, played through my grade 8 Royal Conservatory exam and theory beyond that. If that means anything to anyone, I think this is just a Canadian program, so I'm not sure if that will mean anything to anyone outside of Canada anyway, but I played for a long time and then it just kind of fell off the radar after my piano teacher retired and I moved away from my parents' house, which meant moving away from the piano, among other things. So it's been, a solid decade and a bit and a couple of broken fingers, which have been posing some problems actually, since I played very much, but I've really enjoyed it so far. It just feels really good to have music in the house again in ways that I haven't for a while, so that's been great. In terms of decks, I set myself a kind of low buy for tarot and oracle decks, with a plan to focus on decks that are already in my collection, which I have been doing. I haven't bought any decks in 2020. I have received a few that were kind of long-time pre-orders from 2019, but I haven't been shopping. So that's been fine, and I've been working with some of the decks that have arrived in my collection as well as some old favorites. I also wanted to learn Lenormand this year as my kind of goal, I guess, to learn a new system. And so I've been working with the Caitlin Matthews book, Complete Lenormand Oracle Handbook, still feeling very, very, very much like a beginner with Lenormand. I've read a lot of like the history and the kind of structure of the deck and things like this, but I feel like it's going to take me the whole year to really feel like I'm getting somewhere with that. In terms of other kind of spiritual supplies and things like that, I kind of set myself the goal of not buying anything new except for things that, would run out, like tea lights. If I run out of tea lights, I can buy more tea lights. I mean, I've stuck to that too. I haven't bought anything at all. So in terms of the kind of low buy, no buy elements of the depth year, I've completely stuck to those goals. And I have been enjoying really kind of dedicating my time to a few things. Going back to cross stitch, which I have always found very relaxing as a craft activity, playing music. These things have been really great. Having something to learn, which is Lenormand, has been great too, though admittedly, I have not done very much Lenormand. I've been very busy this month. I have, folks might know that I have 2 jobs, and one of them has really, really ramped up in terms of busyness. And I also picked up some extra work filling in for someone else for a couple of weeks. So I've been working more than I anticipated at my wage jobs. So the studies have not gone quite as quickly as I expected. What I wanted to spend the most time on in terms of this update, though, was my reading. So folks will know, because I shared it and I'll link below, I had made a video kind of related to depth year called The Book Stack of Shame, which was the 10 books that I had bought with the intention of reading them cover to cover, but didn't read, that had been sitting on my shelf. And I set the goal of reading those 10 books before I bought more books, with the caveat that I was allowed to buy books if they were needed for work or for one of my one of my monthly book clubs. But leaving that aside, I was to read the books on the Book Stack of Shame before shopping. So I have bought a couple of books since 2020 started, but I have stuck to the limiting myself only to reading group books. So I have stuck to the goals in terms of purchasing. And I will say for my reading in 2020, I've been really trying to actively spend time reading. And I usually read a lot. But having a pile, I think, has been oddly motivating. So that's been kind of interesting. So of the 10 books on the Book Stack of Shame, I have read 3. I've also read some other books, which I'll talk about in a second. And I've started a 4th. I've decided to tweak the parameters of the book part of the depth year a little bit to actually exclude one of the books on the Book Stack of Shame. And that actually is the Complete Lenormand Oracle Handbook. Because of how the Lenormand reading has gone so far and how much time I think that learning will take me, I'm going to let myself buy other books even if I'm not finished this one, because I plan on basically spending the entire year with this book and not necessarily reading it cover to cover. Now that I'm into it, I don't think it will be as kind of linear of a read as I might have thought. So I'm kind of bracketing that one from the must read all of these before buying things new rule, just because I don't want to rush through it. And I think that now that I'm thinking about this whole reading depth year Book Stack of Shame thing, I don't want it to have the result of me rushing through these books that I bought, just to get through them kind of thing, so that I can check them off of a list and say that I got through them. So I'm resisting that kind of dynamic as well, which is interesting. So yeah, I've read 6 books this month, 3 of which were Book Stack of Shame. And then of the other 3, one was a book that I had received for Christmas as a gift. So it wasn't one that I had bought. One was for work. I'm teaching, and I mentioned that I had picked up some fill-in work. So I picked up teaching 2 lectures for another class. So I read a full book cover to cover for that. and then also one book in a reading group context. So lots and lots of reading in January. So briefly, the books that I had mentioned, just in case anybody is interested in these, because so far, there's not a single book on my January reading list pile that I wouldn't recommend to at least someone. The first one I read in like a very short time, a couple of days, was this anthology, Love Beyond Body, Space, and Time, an Indigenous LGBT sci-fi anthology, edited by Hope Nicholson. And so this is a collection, and it says on the back, of Indigenous science fiction and urban fantasy, focusing on LGBT and Two-Spirit characters. So there's lots and lots of stories in there. It's very short. Like, I read this really quickly. It's 120 pages, including the author bios, so really, really short. And there's a very short introduction as well. All of the authors in this collection are Indigenous, and most of them identify as queer, bisexual, lesbian, trans, or Two-Spirit. Some don't, but are supportive of the friends and family who are. So, I will say, of this anthology, inevitably, I think with an edited collection with many authors, there are some that you're going to like more than others. There's certainly some of the stories that I liked more than others. But I will say, and this is not something I say often about an anthology of fiction, of short fiction, which is a genre I read a lot, there was not really any in this book that I didn't like. Certainly I like some more than others. However, I would say that there's not a bad story in the bunch, really. So if this one is one that you think you would be interested in, I absolutely recommend it. I found it at a local bookstore really, really inexpensively, and I'll be keeping it on my bookshelf for sure. So I was happy to read that one. The second book that I read in January, also from the book Stack of Shame, and one that had been sitting on my book shelf for an embarrassingly long time, was Outrage, an anarchist memoir of the penal colony by Clément Duval. And this one was interesting. So this is a book that's set in the penal colony, as the name suggests, and it is in what was then called French Guiana, and Clément Duval is a French anarchist who gets arrested and sent to this penal colony. And he talks about how at the time this penal colony, and it says it on the back actually, now I'm just catching my eye, he talks about how it was called the dry guillotine. So there's this aspect of prisoners like him being sent to the penal colony as this dry guillotine where they will likely not survive, but they're also not being executed in as straightforward a way as could result in them being made into martyrs for social movement, basically. So this one, I would say, by no means would I say that this is like a literary masterpiece, but it's a document of testimony. The penal colony, there's very little written in terms of accounts of what life in the penal colony was like. Very few people who went to this penal colony made it out, and made it out alive. And he did. He escaped. He escaped to America. And so as a kind of account of a really horrible thing, this book is intense and interesting in that way, as a kind of historical document, which, yeah, it was a hard read, if I'm honest. But I think that I got a lot out of it. I'm glad that I read it. It was really inspiring, I think, to read how he, and some of the others who he describes meeting there, how he maintained his belief in humanity, I guess, like to kind of paraphrase, or at least subsections of humanity, we'll say. And kept his, it was really, he talks about like maintaining his dignity in the face of like being really, really ill-treated, in ways that I think are really powerful. I had bookmarked some pieces, as well. He talks about, at one point that I bookmarked, a lot of the book is dealing with these kind of aborted or failed escape attempts that they're making, right? They're like building rafts and trying to figure out how to get out. And he, at this point in the book that I bookmarked, he says, "Today I can contemplate things more objectively. Was it not the instinct of self-preservation, the hope of seeing our loved ones again, that paralyzed the spontaneous movement that had been brewing for so long when they were going to rise up? And all this in spite of ourselves, in spite of the ideal that we held so close to our hearts, making us so mindful of our dignity, which, however, we must admit that in spite of all our efforts to preserve it, we constantly left behind a little piece of it by accepting such a miserable existence." And so he explores these kind of ideas about self-preservation and kind of hesitation to resist when all these odds are stacked against you. And, at the very end of the book, he, the extent to which there's any kind of moral is like, don't get caught. Don't go to the penal colony. So it was a really powerful historical account, for sure. And another quite short read as well. The third book that I read was for Kelly Bear's Literary Witches series. So Farah Forexad was our author for January that was chosen, and I read the full book, Sin, Selected Poems. And so for the purpose of the group, there were a few poems that were bookmarked that had been mentioned in the Literary Witches book, that were the kind of required reading. And then if you wanted to read the whole book, that was the kind of extra credit, we'll say. And I read the whole book, and it was really beautiful. I struggle to talk about poetry. It's not a thing that I know a lot about. I can identify, I guess, poetry that I like or that I respond to or that I find evocative, and this was all of those things. But poetry is a thing that I struggle to feel like I have a lot that's particularly intelligent to say, just because I don't know a lot about it, to be honest. But I really like the way that this book was put together in terms of having some references for some of the historical and culturally specific kind of language that you might not know as a reader. And there's a section on Iran's political scene, 1941 to 1967, to contextualize Farrokhzad's work in that way. I underlined pieces of the poems that I found beautiful. It's very evocative poetry for sure. And I'm really glad that I read it. And something that's great about this Literary Witches group, and do check out Kelly Bear's channel and her video on the Literary Witches project if you haven't already. Something that's really great is that it's bringing me to be reading books that I, if it weren't for the deck and the Literary Witches book and this project, that I wouldn't probably necessarily have come across, and this was one of them. So I'm glad to have gotten to read that one, which was not on the book stack of shame, but was for the reading group. And the last of the 3 books from the so-called book stack of shame that I finished just recently, and that was this other anthology of fiction called The Djinn Falls in Love and Other Stories, edited by Mavesh Murad and Jared Shurin. So this is a collection of stories that all relate in some way or another to jinn, these spirits, and it was really interesting. I had never read a lot of the authors in here. There are a few, like Nnedi Okorafor, who I've read before, but most of them not. And this one, I think there were some real gems in this one that I really, really enjoyed, and I've kind of bookmarked and written in pencil which stories that I really loved. This one, I think, compared to the other one, I did find a little bit more inconsistent. There were some in here that really didn't work for me, and that's just, it's personal. It's totally subjective. There were some stories that I just didn't think were, like, so effective at maybe what they were trying to do, but there were some really incredible stories in here. So I'm really glad that I read this one, and something that, to me speaks to a really good anthology of short stories with different authors, is that what I do have now is a much longer to read list, because I went through and searched the authors who I was less familiar with, who I hadn't read anything else by, and put made some notes on those. So now I have some more authors that I'm interested in finding out more about and reading more from. So I'm grateful to this book, The Djinn Falls in Love, for that. The next book I read in January, which I finished about a week ago, is one called Ancillary Justice by Anne Leckie. And this is a book that I got for Christmas from my brother. And you can see on the front, it's a Hugo and Nebula Award winner. And on the back, it says it's a winner of the Hugo, the Nebula, the Arthur C. Clarke Award, the Locus Award, and the BSFA Award. So, a ton of awards. And I'm coming to this one a little bit late, actually, because it's the first one in a trilogy, and I'm not sure, the Ancillary trilogy, so there's Ancillary Justice, Ancillary Sword, and Ancillary Mercy. I'm not sure if this is actually a trilogy or if it's a series, like that there could be, an eventual fourth book or more books. But I read the first one. Really, really interesting. The premise, I guess, to try to not... I won't give any away spoilers that aren't already on the back. Basically, the main character of this book is a artificial intelligence that was a sentient spaceship, like the artificial intelligence system that kind of manages and operates this spaceship. But then at different points in the book, that intelligence also has what are called in the book ancillaries, and there's so these bodies that the artificial intelligence is simultaneously in the ship itself, but also in all these individual bodies, so can see like in all these different contexts all at once, right? So in terms of the kind of storytelling and the narrator perspective, that creates a really interesting, not an omniscient narrator, but elements of that, because literally the narrator can be kind of in different places at once, at some parts in the book and not in other parts. So that was really interesting stylistically. Another thing that is really interesting about the way that this book is written is that the language that is the kind of AI's first language, and a number of characters' first language in the books, but not all, because there are different alien species in the book. The language doesn't have gendered pronouns, so the narrator defaults to calling everyone she. So there is a sense in which you don't really know a lot of the characters' genders because they're all referred to as she. But they clarify that that's because of the grammar of the language and not because they are actually all identifying as she. So that's also interesting. It was a bit tricky to get into, but once I did, I was like in. So Ancillary Justice, I'm going to read the other two, not right away, but I do plan on checking them out. So I do think, this one, yeah, super award-winning. I totally see why. I'm glad I read it and plan to read the others. And then on top of all those books, I have one that the one that I don't have to show you because I read it as an ebook, is actually a book that I had read before, but I read again for the purposes of my teaching, and that was Unwashed Catalonia by George Orwell. So that book is the autobiographical account of George Orwell's time as a combatant in the Spanish Civil War. So part of the book, he's talking about being with the militia kind of more in the countryside, I guess, in the trenches. And then the second half is set in the city and is more dealing with conflict on the so-called Republican side of the Spanish Civil War. So between different communist and anarchist and leftist identifying groups. So that was really interesting. I mean, again, I've read it before. It's George Orwell. It's brilliant. It's another like short read. Very much suggest. So that's my six books that I've read. It's been a good reading month, January. So for February, I have lots of reading lined up too. I'm going to keep going with the Lenormand reading, of course. I'm also reading Drawing Down the Moon by Margot Adler, which is a history of paganism in America with some folks in Katie Flower's Blossom Book Club. And for the Literary Witches, I am reading another book that I have read before, but I'm going to read again because it's such an excellent book. And that one is Kindred by Octavia E. Butler. Octavia Butler is one of my all-time favorite authors, like of all time. I was really excited when she got picked for the Literary Witches, and I know that Kelly Bear was too, and she hadn't read Octavia Butler before. So I'm really glad that she got picked. So I'm going to be reading this book again. I will have more to say on that later. This video is already twice as long as I anticipated it being. I will be back with more depthier updates as I go along. I already know one theme that I would like to make a little reflective video about. I will mention, going to be traveling for a little while through the middle of February, so I won't be making videos for a while, though hopefully I'll have a nice travel video when I get back. So I won't be making videos for a while, and I also probably won't be around in the comments. I've been really enjoying, lots of videos this month and commenting where I can, but I will be, traveling around with less access to the internet and not bringing a computer along or anything like that. So if I am quiet or if I don't get back to you, it's not because I'm ignoring you, or that I don't appreciate your comments. I just may not have internet access. So do bear with me and be patient. This month, something that's exciting this month, that I will just say a little bit about here and maybe make another video later, is that my channel birthday is coming up to my 1-year birthday as a YouTube channel. So my 1-year YouTube channel birthday for Aquamarine 18 is this month, it's February, and my actual birthday, like as a human who's getting a year older, is in very early March. So I am planning when I get back to do something special on the channel as a little birthday fun. I'm still scheming up ideas for what exactly my and my channel's shared birthday extravaganza will look like. But it will be fun, and there might be treats. So do keep your keep an eye out for that. I will have some dedicated video or two to channel birthday time, which I'll do something to celebrate. We'll see what it's going to be. I'm not sure yet. Anyway, that's the depth here so far. Things are going well. If you're on any kind of depth here, feel free to share your comments how yours is going, especially, if you don't make videos and you want to share via comments. That is always very, very welcome. I will see you at some point. It may be a couple weeks with the traveling. We'll see. But thank you so much for watching if you have stuck with me through this 28-minute update, mostly dedicated to the shrinking book stack of shame. Much appreciated. I hope everyone is well. Have a great morning or afternoon or evening or weekend, wherever you are, whenever you're watching this, and I'll talk to you again soon. Bye.